The hospital where I devoted 24 years of my life decided I was no longer worth keeping. Not because I made mistakes. Not because patients complained. Not because I failed my job. I was simply considered too expensive. Too experienced. Too old. The executive team believed they could quietly erase everything I had built. They had no idea I had been preparing for that exact day for nearly 8 years. My name is Margaret Lawson. I'm 58 years old. For nearly a quarter of a century, I worked as Director of Clinical Operations at Westbridge Regional Medical Center. Most people never knew my name. Patients certainly didn't. But almost every department in that hospital depended on systems my team designed. When ambulances arrived during multiple car accidents. When operating rooms had to be reorganized within minutes. When winter storms overloaded the emergency department. When power outages forced us onto emergency generators. Someone had already created the procedures everyone followed. That someone was usually me. I never wanted recognition. I only wanted the hospital to function safely. Healthcare isn't supposed to be glamorous. Supposed to save lives. For years, our hospital was exactly that. Not perfect, but honest. The nurses stayed because they cared. The physicians worked impossible hours because they believed in their patients. The administrators understood that budgets mattered, but patient safety mattered more. Then everything changed. Our nonprofit hospital was purchased by a large healthcare investment group. They promised modernization, efficiency, innovation. The board celebrated the announcement. Employees were told nothing significant would change. Within 6 months, everything changed. The new chief executive officer was Nathan Reeves, 36 years old, an MBA from an elite business school. No clinical background. No hospital administration experience beyond financial consulting. His presentations were polished. His speeches were full of words like optimization, performance metrics, operational efficiency, revenue enhancement. Whenever doctors asked about patient care, he redirected the conversation toward profitability. At first, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. Every new leader deserves a chance. During our first meeting, I spent nearly 2 hours explaining how our emergency operations worked. I showed him disaster preparedness plans, staffing models, critical supply chains, regulatory compliance requirements. He barely looked at the documents. Instead, he asked one question. How many management positions can realistically be eliminated? I stared at him. I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. That became his favorite question. Every meeting. Every department. Every decision. How much money can we save? Who can we eliminate? What costs too much? Within months, consultants flooded the hospital. Most had never worked inside healthcare. They walked through patient care units carrying tablets. They timed nurses, measured walking distances, calculated how long physicians spent inside patient rooms. Everything became data. Nothing remained human. Experienced nurses began disappearing. Some accepted retirement packages. Others were reassigned. Several resigned before they could be pushed out. Department supervisors with decades of institutional knowledge were replaced by younger managers earning half the salary. Human resources called it restructuring. Everyone else called it what it really was. Replacing experience with cheaper labor. I watched people leave who had trained entire generations of healthcare workers. One nurse had spent 31 years in neonatal intensive care. She received a 12-minute meeting. Then security escorted her to collect her belongings. Watching that broke something inside me, because I realized, if they could do that to her, eventually they would do it to all of us, including me. That's when I made a decision. I stopped assuming leadership would eventually come to its senses. Instead, I started documenting everything. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted accountability. First it was simple. Copies of policy changes, meeting minutes, budget directives, emails instructing managers to reduce staffing below recommended safety levels. Nothing dramatic, just records. Then the irregularities became impossible to ignore. Our billing department suddenly reported dramatic increases in reimbursement. Oddly dramatic. Procedures that had previously required physician approval were being billed under more expensive diagnostic categories. Certain insurance claims seemed unusually optimized. When I asked questions, finance executives avoided direct answers. I wasn't part of billing, so they insisted it wasn't my concern. Except inaccurate documentation becomes everyone's concern inside a hospital, especially when patient records are involved. A few months later, another issue surfaced. Laboratory processing. Historically, specialized pathology work had always been performed by certified regional laboratories. Suddenly, contracts changed. Testing was outsourced to unfamiliar companies. Turnaround times became inconsistent. Several physicians privately complained that results looked incomplete. One surgeon even requested repeat testing because he didn't trust the reports. Administration dismissed every concern. Cost-effective partnerships. That's what they called them. But something didn't feel right. Then procurement changed. Pharmaceutical purchasing contracts shifted almost overnight. Certain medications became mandatory suppliers despite higher complication rates reported by physicians. Doctors complained. Pharmacists complained. Nobody listened. One evening, while reviewing inventory approvals, I noticed signatures authorizing contracts from board members who had never previously handled procurement decisions. That struck me as unusual. Board members establish governance. They don't normally negotiate medication suppliers. Unless there was another reason. By then, I had filled several locked filing cabinets at home. Not with stolen documents. With copies of records I was legally authorized to access through my position. Public reports. Policy revisions. Internal communications. Meeting summaries. Compliance notices. Everything carefully organized. Dates. Names. Timelines. Patterns. My husband occasionally asked why I spent weekends sorting paperwork. I always gave the same answer. Something isn't right. He believed me. He'd watched me dedicate half my life to that hospital. He knew I wasn't paranoid. I simply trusted my instincts. Years passed. The atmosphere inside Westbridge became colder. Managers stopped questioning executives. Employees avoided speaking openly. People feared losing their jobs. Then came the meeting that changed my life forever. It lasted less than 15 minutes. Nathan smiled the entire time. Not once did he ask about my work. Not once did he mention my performance evaluations. Instead, he slid a folder across the conference table. Inside was a retirement package. Effective immediately. And before I could say a single word, he leaned back in his chair and calmly said, "Margaret, healthcare needs fresh leadership for the future." For a few seconds I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. I looked down at the papers again. My name. My employee number. 24 years of service. A generous-sounding retirement package. 3 weeks of transition pay. A confidentiality agreement. A clause stating that by accepting the offer, I would waive any future claims against the hospital. Every page had already been prepared. This wasn't a discussion. It was an exit plan. I slowly closed the folder. "Nathan," I said as calmly as I could, "are you telling me I'm being forced out?" He smiled with the kind of expression people use when they believe they're being compassionate. "We're restructuring the leadership team. I've exceeded every performance target you've given me. This isn't about performance. Then what is it about?" He folded his hands. "The healthcare industry is changing. We need executives who can adapt to new business models. I've adapted for 24 years. I'm not questioning your dedication." "Then explain why I'm leaving." He hesitated, only for a second, but it was enough. "We're building a younger leadership culture." There it was. Not hidden. Not implied. Spoken out loud. Younger. I had spent decades helping build the hospital's emergency response system. I had coordinated disaster drills with local police and fire departments. I had led the operations center during floods, ice storms, disease outbreaks, and mass casualty incidents. None of that mattered anymore. All they saw was my age. And my salary. "I'd like that in writing," I said. His smile disappeared. "I don't think that's necessary." "I do. We're offering you an excellent retirement package." I asked for your reason. "Our legal department has prepared everything appropriately." Of course they had. Lawyers rarely allow executives to say too much. I stood up. I won't be signing today. Nathan nodded as though he expected that answer. Take a few days. I will. As I reached the door, he added one more sentence. I hope you don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. I didn't answer. Because I suddenly realized something. He believed I was powerless. To him, I was another employee nearing retirement. Someone who would quietly pack a few framed photographs into a cardboard box. Someone who would disappear. He couldn't have been more wrong. The following morning I arrived before sunrise. Not to clear my office. To finish something I had started years earlier. My office overlooked the ambulance entrance. For decades, that view reminded me why my work mattered. Patients didn't care about organizational charts. They cared that someone was ready when their worst day arrived. I unlocked my filing cabinet. Inside were ordinary folders, budgets, emergency planning, inspection reports. Nothing unusual. The important records were somewhere else. 8 years earlier, after the first questionable policy changes, I had begun creating a detailed timeline. Every significant administrative decision. Every unusual financial directive. Every staffing reduction that violated internal safety recommendations. Every compliance concern that was quietly dismissed. I never altered documents. I never removed originals. I simply preserved copies of records I was authorized to access. Alongside each document, I wrote notes explaining the context. Who attended the meeting? What questions were asked? Who objected? Who remained silent? At first, I thought I was simply protecting myself. Eventually, I realized I was documenting something much larger. Patterns. Patterns are difficult to explain away. One isolated incident can be blamed on misunderstanding. Two can be called coincidence. Dozens spread across years tell a different story. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Linda, Chief Nursing Officer. One of the finest leaders I'd ever worked with. She didn't waste time with small talk. I heard. So it travels fast. Everyone knows. They're moving quickly. I know. There was silence. Then she quietly asked, did they offer you the agreement? Yes. Don't sign it. I wasn't planning to. I figured. She lowered her voice. Margaret. There are people who need to talk to you. That afternoon, 3 department managers visited my office separately. None stayed longer than 10 minutes. None wanted to be seen together. The first was from pharmacy. He explained that purchasing rules had changed dramatically. Medication substitutions were now driven almost entirely by contract pricing. Several physicians had submitted written concerns. Those reports seemed to disappear. The second visitor worked in compliance. She admitted that internal audits were increasingly limited. Certain financial records required executive approval before review. That had never happened before. The third meeting disturbed me the most. A supervisor from medical records closed my office door before speaking. I shouldn't be here. You don't have to say anything. No. You need to hear this. She explained that coding staff had been pressured to maximize reimbursement classifications whenever documentation allowed even slight interpretation. Whenever coders questioned decisions, managers reminded them about productivity expectations. Nobody explicitly ordered fraud. Instead, employees were encouraged to interpret everything in the most profitable possible way. The distinction sounded subtle. Legally, it wasn't. Over the next week, more conversations followed. A physician described delayed maintenance on aging surgical equipment because replacement costs had been postponed. An infection control specialist admitted staffing shortages had affected inspection schedules. A laboratory coordinator questioned the qualifications of one outsourced testing contractor. Individually, each concern might have seemed manageable. Together, they formed a disturbing picture. Not necessarily one massive criminal conspiracy, something more believable. A culture where financial targets consistently outweighed professional judgment. Exactly the kind of environment regulators take seriously. That weekend, I opened every storage box in my home office. 8 years of records covered the floor. My husband walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. He looked around quietly. I've never seen all of it together. Neither have I. It tells quite a story. It tells the truth. He sat beside me. What are you going to do? I already knew the answer. I won't go to the media. He nodded. They'll turn it into headlines. I want facts, not headlines. So, I'm going to the authorities. The next several days were spent organizing everything. Not emotionally. Methodically. Chronological timelines. Supporting documents. Policy revisions. Board minutes. Email chains. Compliance reports. Staffing analyses. Procurement records. Cross-referenced. Indexed. Every claim supported by documentation. Every document connected to a date. Every date connected to a decision. I knew one thing after 24 years in healthcare. Investigators don't care about outrage. They care about evidence. When everything was finished, the report filled several large binders. It represented nearly a decade of careful observation. Not assumptions. Not rumors. Evidence. On Monday morning, I contacted the State Office of Health Facility Oversight. They transferred me to a senior investigator. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked only one question. Can you support these allegations with documentation? I looked at the binders covering my dining room table. Yes, I answered. I can. Within 48 hours, they requested a formal meeting. I realized then that my retirement was no longer the biggest story. It was only the event that had finally forced the truth into the open. 2 investigators arrived at my home on a rainy Thursday morning. They introduced themselves, showed their identification, and thanked me for agreeing to meet privately. Neither of them rushed. Neither promised dramatic results. That immediately reassured me. Real investigators don't begin with conclusions. They begin with questions. For nearly 6 hours we sat around my dining room table. One document after another. One timeline after another. Every time I described an event, they asked the same thing. How do you know this? I appreciated that. Evidence should always be questioned. When I couldn't personally verify something, I said so. If a concern came from another employee, I identified it as a witness statement rather than a proven fact. If a document raised questions but didn't prove misconduct by itself, I made that clear. By the end of the meeting, one investigator closed the final binder and looked at me. You've organized this better than most legal teams. I've had 8 years. He gave a small smile. I can see that. Before leaving, they asked one final question. Have you shared these records with anyone else? No. Please don't. I wasn't planning to. For everyone's protection, let us handle this from here. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not because I believed everything would suddenly be fixed, but because I was no longer carrying the burden alone. The investigation began quietly, almost invisibly. No police cars, no television cameras, no dramatic announcements. People inside the hospital noticed only small changes. Requests for documents, unexpected interviews, additional compliance reviews, auditors asking unusually detailed questions. Nathan acted as though nothing was happening. In fact, he became even more confident. Through former coworkers, I learned that another wave of organizational restructuring had begun. Several department directors over 50 were asked to consider early retirement. Managers with decades of experience were replaced by younger administrators with impressive resumes, but very little hospital experience. It wasn't personal. It was a business strategy, or at least that's what employees were told. Then the investigators started finding things I had never known about. That was the part that surprised even me. My records had opened the door. Their subpoenas opened every other one. Financial analysts uncovered consulting contracts awarded without proper competitive review. Compliance officers discovered internal reports that had never been presented to the board's quality committee. Procurement records revealed unusually close relationships between certain vendors and outside consulting firms. None of those findings came from me. They came from official investigations. The deeper they looked, the more questions appeared. About a month later, Linda called again. They've interviewed half the executive floor. I expected that. You know what's strange? What? People are finally talking. Fear had ruled the hospital for years. Now it was beginning to disappear. Employees who had stayed silent started cooperating. Former staff members agreed to provide statements. Retired physicians returned to answer investigators' questions. Even people who had accepted severance packages came forward. Not because they wanted revenge, because they wanted the hospital they loved to survive. One afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call. It was the chairman of the hospital board, the same man who had attended countless meetings over the years. He sounded exhausted. "I'd like to meet. I think that's inappropriate while an investigation is ongoing." "I understand." There was a long pause. "I owe you an apology. I wasn't prepared for that." "For what?" "We should have listened." I looked out the window before answering. I tried to raise concerns. "I know. No one wanted to hear them." "I know." His voice sounded older than I remembered. "We trusted the wrong people." That sentence stayed with me, because leadership failures rarely happen overnight. They happen one ignored warning at a time, one uncomfortable question dismissed, one experienced employee overlooked, one compromise justified as temporary, until eventually, the culture changes. 6 weeks after the investigation began, state regulators arrived at Westbridge Regional Medical Center. Not secretly, officially. Entire departments were asked to preserve records. Computers were secured. Financial databases were copied. Compliance files were reviewed. Word spread through the building within hours. Employees gathered quietly in break rooms. Nobody knew exactly what would happen, but everyone understood something important. The truth was finally being examined. Nathan reportedly called an emergency executive meeting. He insisted the hospital had done nothing wrong. He described the investigation as routine. Few people believed him anymore. Too many questions had already surfaced. Then came the board meeting. Ironically, I had no intention of attending. My role was finished. I had provided evidence. The investigators were doing their work. But late that morning I received another phone call. This time from the board chairman. "Would you be willing to come?" "Why?" "There may be questions only you can answer." After a long silence I agreed. Walking back into the hospital after nearly 2 months felt surreal. The lobby looked exactly the same. Volunteers greeted visitors. Patients checked in. Wheelchairs rolled across polished floors. Life continued. Hospitals never stop, no matter what happens inside the executive offices. When I entered the boardroom, nearly every seat was occupied. Board members, attorneys, outside investigators, compliance officials, independent auditors. Nathan sat at the far end of the table. For the first time since I had met him, he didn't look confident. He looked worried. Very worried. The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. Investigators presented timelines, audit findings, financial discrepancies, compliance failures, witness testimony. Every conclusion was supported by documentation. No speculation. No exaggeration. Just facts. One by one, executives were questioned. Some answered confidently. Others struggled to explain decisions that suddenly looked very different under independent review. Finally, attention turned toward Nathan. He defended the restructuring. He defended outsourcing. He defended staffing reductions. But every answer led to another document, another email, another approval, another inconsistency. By late afternoon, the board voted to place him on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Security officers quietly escorted him from the executive floor. No handcuffs, no shouting, no dramatic scene, just silence. Sometimes, silence says more than anything else. After Nathan left the building, no one applauded. No one celebrated. This wasn't a victory. It was the beginning of a long process of repairing years of broken trust. The investigation continued for several more months. Independent auditors reviewed thousands of financial records. State health officials completed extensive compliance inspections. Outside legal counsel interviewed dozens of current and former employees. Not every concern I had documented turned out to be a violation. Some decisions, while unpopular, had been legal. Others reflected poor judgment rather than misconduct. But enough serious problems were confirmed to justify sweeping action. Investigators concluded that hospital leadership had repeatedly placed financial performance ahead of patient safety recommendations. Several billing practices failed to meet regulatory standards. Certain outsourcing agreements had bypassed required oversight procedures. Internal compliance warnings had not been properly escalated to the board. Multiple executives resigned before the final reports were released. Others were dismissed after the board accepted the investigators' findings. Nathan eventually faced civil and regulatory proceedings related to management decisions made during his tenure. The planned acquisition of Westbridge Regional Medical Center was suspended indefinitely. Potential investors walked away. At first, many people feared that meant the hospital would close. Instead, something unexpected happened. Community leaders stepped in. Local physicians organized public forums. Former patients wrote letters supporting the hospital. Nurses volunteered extra time to help stabilize struggling departments. The hospital wasn't being abandoned. It was being reclaimed. Several weeks later, I received another phone call from the chairman of the board. This time his voice sounded different. Not defeated. Hopeful. "Margaret, we'd like to meet again." I almost declined. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure I wanted to walk back into another boardroom. Still, I agreed. The atmosphere was completely different. There were no expensive consultants. No flashy presentations. No promises about maximizing revenue. Instead, the board asked questions. Real questions. What do employees need? How do we rebuild trust? Where did we fail? What should we do differently? For the first time in years, patient care, not profit, was the center of the conversation. Finally, the chairman looked directly at me. "We'd like you to return." I smiled politely. "I already retired, remember?" A few people lowered their eyes. He nodded. "We know." He slid a folder across the table. For one brief moment, I remembered the retirement package Nathan had pushed toward me only months earlier. This folder felt completely different. Inside was an offer. Not for retirement. For leadership. The board wanted me to become interim executive director, while they searched for a permanent chief executive. I closed the folder without answering immediately. "I have one condition." Everyone waited. "No more decisions that treat experienced employees like numbers on a spreadsheet." Heads nodded. "Second." I continued. "Compliance reports go directly to the board without executive filtering." Again, agreement. "Third." I looked around the room. If any employee raises a genuine patient safety concern, they are protected, not punished. The chairman didn't hesitate. "Done." I accepted. Returning to the hospital wasn't easy. Some employees hugged me. Others cried. A few apologized for staying silent when I had been forced out. I never blamed them. Fear is powerful. When people worry about paying mortgages, supporting families, or keeping health insurance, silence often feels like survival. What mattered was what happened next. One of my first decisions was to meet with every department. Not executives. Staff. Nurses. Receptionists. Environmental services. Laboratory technicians. Maintenance crews. Residents. Transport teams. The people who kept the hospital running every single day. I asked only one question. If you could change one thing to make this hospital safer, what would it be? I filled notebook after notebook. Many suggestions were surprisingly simple. Repair equipment faster. Reduce unnecessary paperwork. Hire enough night shift nurses. Listen when frontline staff report problems. Respect people's experience. No consultant had discovered those solutions. The people doing the work already knew them. Someone simply had to listen. Over the next year, turnover slowed dramatically. Several respected physicians who had planned to leave decided to stay. Former nurses returned. Employee satisfaction steadily improved. Most importantly, patient safety indicators began moving in the right direction. The improvements didn't happen because of me alone. They happened because hundreds of dedicated professionals finally felt heard again. One afternoon, nearly a year after my return, I walked through the emergency department. Everything looked ordinary. Paramedics wheeled in new patients. Families waited anxiously for updates. Doctors moved quickly from room to room. Nurses coordinated care with quiet confidence. No one paid much attention to me. And that was exactly how I liked it. Hospitals should never revolve around administrators. They should revolve around patients. As I stood near the ambulance entrance, I realized something. The systems we had rebuilt weren't perfect. They never would be. Healthcare is too complicated for perfection. But the people working inside those walls once again believed they were part of something honorable. That belief is worth protecting. Before leaving for the evening, I unlocked the cabinet in my office. Inside sat the binders I had spent 8 years creating. I looked at them for a long moment. Then I carried every one of them to the hospital's legal archive, where they would be preserved as part of the official record. I hoped no one would ever need to create another collection like that again. But if someone did, I hoped they would have the courage to speak before the damage became so great. People often ask whether I regret refusing that retirement package. The answer has never changed. Not for a second. Because I wasn't fighting to save my career. My career had already been built. I was fighting to protect the people who trusted that hospital with their lives. The nurses who skipped meals to comfort frightened patients. The doctors who stayed long after their shifts ended. The technicians who caught mistakes before they became tragedies. The families who believed that when they walked through our doors, every decision would be made for the right reason. That trust is the most valuable thing any hospital possesses. Lose money and it can be earned back. Lose buildings and they can be rebuilt. Lose public trust. And recovery may take generations. They believed they were forcing an aging administrator into quiet retirement. What they failed to understand. I wasn't the easiest person to replace. I was the one who had spent years learning exactly where the hospital had stopped healing itself.